Picture a clay tablet sitting in a museum case in Baghdad, roughly 5,000 years old, roughly the size of a paperback novel, covered in wedge-shaped impressions pressed into its surface by a reed stylus before the clay dried and hardened into permanence. Most people walk past it with mild curiosity. Ancient artifact. Very old. Interesting texture. Next exhibit. Nobody stops to consider that what they are looking at is one of the most consequential objects in the entire history of human civilization, not because of what it is made of or how it was made, but because of what it says. And what it says is, loosely translated from ancient Sumerian, something like 29,086 measures of barley, 37 months. Kushim. Kushim is a name, the oldest personal name in the recorded history of the human species. Not a king, not a god, not a hero. An accountant. The oldest named human being in recorded history was a bureaucrat keeping grain inventory for a temple in ancient Uruk, and the reason we know his name is that he wrote it down on a piece of clay so that whoever checked his accounting would know who to blame if the numbers were wrong. Writing was not invented for poetry. It was not invented for philosophy, for religion, for history, or for the transmission of wisdom across generations. It was invented for the most mundane reason imaginable, so that administrators managing large agricultural economies could keep track of how much stuff was where and who was responsible for it. The technology that would eventually produce the Iliad, the Bible, Shakespeare. And every text message you have ever sent was first deployed in the service of barley accounting. And this, the gap between what writing became and what writing was when it started, is one of the most interesting things about its invention. Start with the question of when, because the answer is not as clean as most people expect, and the complexity of the timeline reveals something important about what counting as writing actually means. The conventional answer is approximately 3,200 BCE in Sumer, ancient Mesopotamia, in what is now southern Iraq. The Sumerian writing system called cuneiform, from the Latin for wedge-shaped, describing the impressions made by a reed stylus in wet clay, appears in the archaeological record at this date in forms complex enough to convey specific numerical information about specific commodities. The Kushim tablet is from approximately this period. The system is not fully developed. It is early, limited, and primarily numerical administrative. But it is unambiguously writing in the sense of marks that encode specific, recoverable information in a conventionalized system. But immediately the timeline gets more complicated, because the question of when humans first invented writing depends entirely on what counts as writing. And that definitional question is not trivial. Marks that encode information predate Sumerian cuneiform by a very long time. Notched bones, bones with deliberate, regular cut marks that appear to record numerical sequences, have been found at sites across Africa and Europe dating back tens of thousands of years. The Ishango bone, found in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, dates to approximately 20,000 years ago and displays a pattern of notches that some researchers interpret as a record of numerical sequences, possibly lunar cycles. The Blombos Cave ochre pieces from South Africa date to approximately 75,000 years ago and carry engraved geometric patterns, cross-hatched lines executed with evident intention and regularity. Whether these constitute a proto-writing system, a symbolic communication system of some kind, or something else entirely, is genuinely debated. They are not random marks. They are intentional, patterned, and clearly meaningful to whoever made them. Whether they meet the threshold for writing depends on how tightly you define the term. Defining writing is necessary before the history of its invention can be told accurately, and the definition matters more than it might initially seem. Writing, in the technical sense used by linguists and historians of writing systems, refers to a system of graphic marks that can reliably encode and convey information in a way that can be recovered by someone who knows the system, without the presence of the person who made the marks. This definition distinguishes writing from art, from decorative patterns, from personal marks, and from the various proto-writing systems that precede full writing in the archaeological record. Under this definition, cave paintings, even the extraordinarily sophisticated ones at Chauvet and Lascaux, depicting animals and figures with breathtaking skill, are not writing. They convey information and meaning, but not through a conventionalized system of marks whose specific information content can be read by someone who knows the code. The paintings communicate, but not linguistically. Tally marks, the notches on bones like the Ishango, are borderline. They encode numerical information in a conventionalized way, but they encode only quantity, not the full range of linguistic information that developed writing systems can convey. Proto-writing systems, systems that use conventionalized marks to convey limited categories of information, typically economic or administrative, but that do not yet systematically encode language, are a middle category that appears repeatedly in the archaeological record across different cultures before full writing emerges. The Sumerian proto-cuneiform of 3200 BCE, in its earliest forms, is technically a proto-writing system. It encodes commodities and quantities, but cannot yet express the full range of spoken Sumerian. Full writing, a system capable of expressing any content of the spoken language, including abstract concepts, narratives, and complex propositions, develops from proto-writing systems through a process that typically takes centuries or millennia. The threshold between proto-writing and full writing is not a moment but a gradient, and different researchers place different systems at different points on that gradient. This definitional complexity is not an evasion of the question. It is the honest answer to the question. Writing was not invented on a Tuesday in 3200 BCE when someone had a bright idea. It was a technology that emerged gradually from earlier information encoding practices, developed incrementally over centuries, and reached the threshold of full linguistic encoding through a process that archaeology can partially reconstruct, but cannot date with the precision that most people expect. The Sumerian cuneiform system is the earliest writing tradition whose developmental trajectory is well documented in the archaeological record, and tracing that development reveals how the technology of writing actually emerges from its precursors. Before cuneiform, Sumerian administrators used a system of clay tokens, small, shaped clay objects of different forms representing different commodities. A sphere might represent a measure of grain. A cylinder might represent an animal. A cone might represent a container of oil. These tokens were used in administrative contexts to record transactions, inventories, and allocations. The same economic functions that early cuneiform would eventually serve. When tokens needed to be sealed for record-keeping purposes, they were enclosed in hollow clay envelopes, bullae, that were then sealed with an official's cylinder seal to authenticate the record. To verify the contents of a bulla without breaking it open, officials began pressing the tokens into the soft clay of the envelope's exterior before enclosing them, leaving impressions that recorded what was inside. And here is the crucial transition. At some point, someone recognized that the impressions on the outside of the envelope contained all the information that the tokens inside conveyed. The envelope itself and the tokens inside became redundant. You could just make the impressions on a flat clay tablet and dispense with the envelope and tokens entirely. The first cuneiform signs were impressions of tokens. They were direct representations of the physical objects they replaced. A drawing of a fish meant fish. A drawing of a jar meant jar. The system was logographic. Each sign represented a concept, a thing in the world, rather than a sound in the language. Logographic systems are limited. They can represent concrete nouns efficiently, but struggle with verbs, adjectives, grammatical relationships, and abstract concepts. The expansion of cuneiform from an administrative commodity tracking system into a full writing system capable of encoding the Sumerian language, including its grammar, its poetry, its religious texts, and its narratives, required the development of the phonographic principle, the use of signs to represent sounds, rather than things. The phonographic principle, once grasped, transforms a pictographic or logographic system into something capable of expressing anything the spoken language can express. A sign that originally meant sun could be repurposed to represent the sound su, allowing it to contribute to the spelling of words that had nothing to do with the sun. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The rebus principle, using a sign for its sound value rather than its meaning, as English speakers use when writing I heart you, was the cognitive breakthrough that made full writing possible. In Sumerian cuneiform, the phonographic principle developed gradually over the centuries following the earliest proto-cuneiform tablets. By approximately 2600 BCE, cuneiform had developed into a system capable of expressing the Sumerian language with relative completeness. A full writing system in the technical sense. The journey from clay tokens to full cuneiform took at least 600 years, probably longer, and involved conceptual innovations whose significance the people making them likely did not recognize at the time. Egyptian hieroglyphics emerge in the archaeological record at approximately the same time as Sumerian proto-cuneiform, around 3200 to 3100 BCE. And the question of whether Egyptian writing was invented independently or developed under influence from the Sumerian tradition is one of the oldest debates in the history of writing. The geographic proximity of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the documented trade connections between the two regions in the late 4th millennium BCE, and certain apparent similarities in the administrative context of early Egyptian writing have led some researchers to propose that the idea of writing, the concept of using marks to encode information, diffused from Mesopotamia to Egypt. Under this model, Egyptians adopted the concept of writing from Sumerian contacts but invented their own system, which is why Egyptian hieroglyphics look nothing like Sumerian cuneiform. Other researchers argue for independent invention, noting that the two systems are so different in their visual form, their structural principles, and their specific developmental trajectories that similarity in timing reflects parallel responses to similar administrative pressures rather than diffusion from a common source. The current scholarly consensus leans toward the diffusion model for the concept of writing, the idea that information could be encoded in marks. While acknowledging that the specific Egyptian writing system was an indigenous Egyptian invention. Egyptians may have learned from Mesopotamian contacts that writing was possible and useful. They then invented their own way of doing it. Egyptian hieroglyphics are, from the beginning, more phonographically developed than early Sumerian cuneiform. The earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions already incorporate phonetic elements, signs used for their sound values, in ways that suggest the phonographic principle was understood from the outset of the Egyptian system's development. This earlier phonographic sophistication may reflect the advantage of developing a writing system when the concept of phonography was already floating in the broader cultural environment through contact with the Mesopotamian tradition. The Chinese writing system represents the most compelling case for fully independent invention of writing in the ancient world, and its development raises profound questions about the cognitive prerequisites for writing invention. The earliest unambiguous Chinese writing, oracle bone script, inscriptions carved on animal bones and turtle shells used in divination, dates to approximately 1200 BCE, over 2,000 years after the emergence of Sumerian cuneiform. But oracle bone script, even at its earliest documented stage, is a sophisticated, relatively complete writing system with thousands of signs, phonographic elements, and the capacity to express complex content. Its sophistication at the earliest documented stage suggests a prior developmental history that has not been preserved. Some researchers propose that Chinese writing has developmental roots going back to pottery marks and other symbolic systems from much earlier periods, possibly as early as 5000 BCE. But the evidence for continuous development from these early marks to oracle bone script is not firmly established. What can be said is that Chinese writing shows no demonstrable derivation from Mesopotamian or Egyptian systems, and appears to represent an independent invention of the technology. The independence of Chinese writing invention is significant because it means writing was invented at least twice, and possibly more times, independently by human populations working from the same basic cognitive equipment in different parts of the world. This tells something important about writing. It is not an invention so peculiar and difficult that it required the most extraordinary cognitive leap in human history to achieve once. It is an invention that follows from certain economic and administrative conditions reaching sufficient complexity, combined with human symbolic cognition that was capable of the necessary conceptual innovations. The conditions produce the invention, given enough time and enough people working on the problem incrementally. Mesoamerica adds another dimension to the independent invention story, and the writing systems that developed in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica are among the most understudied and underappreciated in the global history of writing. The Olmec civilization, the Zapotec, and eventually the Maya all developed writing systems in Mesoamerica with no demonstrable connection to Old World writing traditions. The Maya writing system, the most fully developed of the Mesoamerican scripts, was a sophisticated logosyllabic system capable of expressing the Mayan language completely, combining logograms representing whole words with syllabic signs representing phonetic components. Maya writing records dynastic history, astronomical calculations, ritual calendrics, mythological narratives, and political propaganda. At its height, it was used to inscribe texts on stone monuments, ceramic vessels, wooden lintels, and folded bark paper books called codices. It was, by any standard, a complete and sophisticated writing system fully comparable to the mature writing systems of the Old World. The decipherment of Maya writing, which proceeded substantially through the work of scholars in the latter half of the 20th century, revealed that a system long thought to be primarily calendrical and ritual in nature was in fact a complete linguistic encoding of the spoken Mayan language. The breakthroughs in decipherment showed that Maya writing used the same phonographic principle, signs representing sounds, that underlies all other full writing systems, arrived at independently through the developmental logic that writing systems follow when they are trying to expand their expressive range. The parallel invention of the phonographic principle in Mesoamerica, completely independently from its development in the Old World, is one of the most powerful demonstrations that writing is a technology with discoverable logic that human minds can arrive at from different starting points given sufficient developmental pressure. The Indus Valley script represents the most tantalizing unsolved puzzle in the entire history of writing, a system of signs used by one of the ancient world's most sophisticated urban civilizations that has resisted all decipherment attempts and remains completely unread. The Indus Valley civilization, centered in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, was at its height between approximately 2600 and 1900 BCE. Its cities, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and others, were planned urban centers with sophisticated drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, and clear evidence of complex administration. Among the material remains of the civilization are thousands of small seals and tablets bearing the Indus script, a system of signs whose signs and structural features can be cataloged but whose meaning cannot be determined. The Indus script has never been deciphered. The civilization that produced it collapsed around 1900 BCE. Its successor cultures left no bilingual texts that would provide a translation key, analogous to the Rosetta Stone's role in Egyptian hieroglyphic decipherment, and the underlying language, if the script encoded a language at all, is unknown and unconnected to any surviving tradition that would provide interpretive leverage. Some researchers argue that the Indus script is a full writing system encoding an unknown language. Others argue that it is a proto-writing system encoding limited administrative or ritual information that never developed into full linguistic encoding. The debate cannot be resolved without decipherment, and decipherment appears unlikely without additional textual evidence of a type that the archaeological record has not yet provided. The Indus script is a reminder that the history of writing has gaps, civilizations that developed writing-like systems whose contents are permanently lost because the chain of cultural transmission was broken before anyone decoded them for outsiders. The development of the alphabet, the specific writing technology that underlies almost every writing system currently in use across the world, represents the most consequential single innovation in the entire history of writing after the invention of writing itself. All full writing systems prior to the alphabet required memorization of hundreds or thousands of signs. Sumerian cuneiform in its mature form used hundreds of signs. Egyptian hieroglyphics had hundreds of signs. Chinese writing, historically, required knowledge of thousands of characters for full literacy. The cognitive burden of acquiring literacy in these systems was substantial, limiting it in practice to scribal specialists who trained for years to master the required sign inventories. The alphabet, a writing system in which a small set of signs, typically 20 to 30, represents the consonant or consonant and vowel sounds of the language, reduced this cognitive burden dramatically. Learning an alphabet requires memorizing a few dozen signs rather than hundreds or thousands. The reduction in barrier to literacy was enormous. The first alphabet emerged among Semitic-speaking peoples of the ancient Near East, probably in the Sinai Peninsula or the Levant, around 1800 to 1900 BCE. This Proto-Sinaitic script represented only consonants, not vowels, a consonantal alphabet or abjad, and was adapted from Egyptian hieroglyphics, with individual hieroglyphic signs repurposed as consonantal phonograms based on the acrophonic principle. The sign for a word beginning with a given consonant sound was repurposed to represent that consonant sound alone. The acrophonic principle is elegant in its simplicity. The Egyptian hieroglyph for house, a floor plan square shape, stood for the Semitic word for house, bayit. The consonant the word began with was bibai. The sign was repurposed to represent babaf in the new consonantal alphabet. Repeat this process for each of the consonants in the language, starting from a repertoire of hieroglyphic signs. And you have derived an alphabet from logographic/phonographic origins through a procedure any literate person familiar with both systems could in principle execute. This Semitic abjad gave rise to the Phoenician script, which spread through Mediterranean trading networks with the extraordinary efficiency of a technology so useful and learnable that every literate people it reached immediately recognized its advantages. The Phoenician script was adapted by the Greeks, who made the conceptual leap of systematically representing vowels as well as consonants, producing the first true alphabet in the sense of a writing system that represents all phonemic segments of the spoken language. The Greek alphabet was adapted by the Romans into the Latin alphabet. The Latin alphabet, adapted and modified across 2 millennia of European linguistic history, underlies the writing system of every European language and the many non-European languages written in Roman script today. The writing system used to produce this script is a direct descendant through a traceable chain of adaptation, from the Proto-Sinaitic marks that some anonymous Semitic-speaking person derived from Egyptian hieroglyphics somewhere in the Sinai, approximately 3,800 years ago. Every letter in every word you are reading right now carries that ancestry. The letter B descends from a Phoenician sign called Beth, derived from the Egyptian hieroglyph for house, derived from the pictographic representation of an actual house. The history of the alphabet is preserved in the letters themselves, not in their modern forms, which have been transformed beyond visual recognition through millennia of adaptation, but in the etymological and historical record of their derivation. The social consequences of writing's invention were so transformative and so wide-ranging that tracing them all would require a library rather than a script. But certain consequences deserve particular emphasis because they reveal how completely writing changed what was possible for human civilization. Memory became external. Before writing, the sum of human knowledge available to any individual was limited by what that individual's brain could retain, supplemented by what could be transmitted through oral tradition, which is powerful but lossy, subject to variation and gradual transformation across generations. Writing allowed information to be stored outside human memory, in a medium that did not forget, did not misremember, and did not die when its author died. The accumulation of knowledge across generations became possible in a way it had not been previously. A scholar in Egypt in 2500 BCE could read texts written by Egyptian scholars of 3000 BCE. A Greek philosopher of 400 BCE could engage with Egyptian mathematical texts centuries older than his civilization. Isaac Newton famously described seeing further by standing on the shoulders of giants, and the shoulders he stood on were made in large part of written text. Legal systems became codifiable and enforceable across populations that never met the lawmakers. Contracts between strangers became possible because the written record of the agreement did not require both parties to trust each other's memory of what had been agreed. Commerce at scales impossible in oral cultures became manageable because records could travel with goods over distances and time frames that human memory could not reliably bridge. History became possible. Before writing, the past beyond living memory was mythology, shaped by oral transmission, adapted to present concerns, and fundamentally unreliable as a record of what had actually happened. Writing created the possibility of preserving accounts of specific events, in specific detail, with dates and names, producing the recoverable past that historical scholarship works with. The Cuneiform tablet with its barley inventory is not just an accounting record, it is the beginning of recorded history, the first moment in human experience when the past was anchored in something more permanent than memory. Here is where the full account of writing's invention arrives at something that the clay tablet in the museum case cannot communicate through its placard. The invention of writing is not just the invention of a technology for recording information. It is the invention of a new relationship between the human mind and time. Before writing, humans lived in an eternal present, with access to the past only through what living minds retained and oral tradition transmitted. After writing, the past became accessible. The future became plannable across spans beyond any individual's lifetime, and knowledge could accumulate across generations rather than being repeatedly rediscovered. Cuneiform the accountant, pressing his reed into clay to record 29,086 measures of barley, was not inventing literature. He was not thinking about the Iliad or the Bible or the tax code or the internet. He was trying to keep his grain inventory straight. The consequences of what he was doing, or what his predecessors were doing when they first developed the system he was using, extended in every direction that human civilization has subsequently traveled. Writing is why you know about ancient Egypt. It is why you know about Mesopotamia, about ancient China, about the Roman Empire and the Greek philosophers and the history of every civilization that left a written record. It is why human knowledge compounds across generations rather than resetting with each death of a knowledgeable person. It is why you are reading this now rather than hearing it told around a fire. The clay tablet in the museum case is not ancient. It is, in the most meaningful sense, contemporary, a document from the beginning of the tradition you are participating in right now. The barley inventory and the script you are currently reading are separated by 5,000 years of intermediate steps, each building on what came before, the chain unbroken from a reed pressed into wet clay in ancient Uruk to whatever device is presenting these words to your eyes. Cuneiform kept meticulous records. He would be pleased that his work has held up.